All right. Well, welcome back to the Bioactive Podcast. Today, I'm very excited to talk to an author, a writer, and a investigator, I guess, Alex Halperin, who recently co-authored a piece that was titled "The Dirty Secret of California's Legal Weed." An LA Times / WeedWeek investigation finds alarming levels of pesticides in cannabis products at dispensaries across the state. And I know this is an article that's been talked about a lot and definitely opened a lot of eyes. So Alex, welcome to the show. And if you could give a quick introduction just to who you are and kind of what you do before we dive into this article a little more.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. My name's Alex Halperin. I'm a reporter, I guess a business reporter, and I've been covering primarily the cannabis industry for the last 10 years. So sort of almost all of the sort of legalization era. And I write for a lot of publications, but mainly for my newsletter, WeedWeek, which covers the industry largely in California.
Awesome. And I'm also going to put the link to the show notes for this article in WeedWeek. If anybody wants to just subscribe and read it, you don't need to pay anything. You just need to become a subscriber, and it's open access for anyone there. So are you a cannabis consumer? Just out of curiosity before we dive into like safety and all of this new information. Yeah, awesome. Okay, cool. So I read this whole story and I found it absolutely intriguing. And something that I thought was really interesting about the story is how it came to be that you even started investigating this. Seems like there was a lot of people talking about it. There was certain lab testing companies that were going to the regulators in the state and saying, hey, we have an issue here. And there wasn't a lot of listening happening. Would you mind kind of walking us through the beginning parts of what led up to this article?
Sure. So a couple of years ago, some, I guess we'll call them whistleblower labs, wrote to the cannabis regulator in California, the Department of Cannabis Control, and said that they were finding all these products that had more THC in them that didn't have as much THC in them as was on the label. And this is sort of a widely acknowledged problem of lab shopping because stronger products are more appealing to some consumers, even though a lot of connoisseurs say, it's not really about THC, it's about the terpenes or whatnot. But clearly having more potent products is a good way to move more products. And so in California and quite a few other states, brands can essentially choose a lab to run its compliance test for it. And if they don't like the results, they can choose another lab to give their business to. So as a result, there was a lot of labs allegedly sort of boosting the THC of their products to keep their customers happy. And this upset some of the labs that claimed they were doing it right and losing business because they were being honest. And they complained, they did their own testing and they sent the results to the DCC, and the DCC didn't do anything. And this annoyed them. And then they followed up by saying, hey, we also found these pesticides that California doesn't allow in these products, and there was a correlation between the labs that were dishonest on the potency and offering sort of scrubbing the pesticides. So I wrote about 2 years ago. I wrote a story where I bought some pre-rolls and had them tested at a couple labs, at 2 different labs, to try and get a fair reading. And all 7 of the pre-rolls had less THC than their label said. And some were about 20% inflated, one was about 500% inflated. It said it had about 55%, but it actually had about 8%.
55% was recorded on that COA.
I mean, that's pretty common. And as people were noting at the time, I mean, that really sort of, especially for like a joint or a blunt, like that doesn't seem really physically possible. But so it was happening. Uh, and so I wrote a story with my tests, and it got a fair amount of attention and led to some of the brands being sued by customers claiming, and this I think even got a mention on Colbert, that they weren't getting as high as they had paid to get. And so I was also interested in the pesticide issue, but it was more complicated because among other things, THC inflation isn't really a health hazard. It's a sort of a marketing
Right,
ploy.
it's false advertising, but it's not going to hurt you to the extent that some illegal carcinogen is, like we're talking about with pesticides. Yeah.
And to the extent that, and also just, it seemed like the kind of thing where if it was happening, it needed a bigger audience than my newsletter audience.
Yeah.
And I was talking to the LA Times about sort of a different story idea. I live in Long Beach, so not too far away. And at the same time, one of their great reporters, Paige St. John, had covered some of the illegal farms that were sprouting up and sort of taking over sort of vast rural areas of the state, very remote areas. One of them being Siskiyou County, which is on the Oregon border.
Okay.
And she had, in her reporting, she had encountered various pesticides as well that on these illegal farms, but which the product nonetheless seemed to be getting inverted into the legal supply chain. Excuse me. So the reporter introduced us, and we all started talking, and that's sort of how this story came together. And Paige did a separate story on some of the illegal pesticides that she found reporting up north as well.
Okay, so for this LA Times WeedWeek report, how many samples were you looking at? And was it all flour? Was some of it concentrates? Were you looking at any edibles? Like, what types of products were testing hot for these pesticides? And then we'll get into like what these actual pesticides were.
Sure. So we were mainly testing vapes.
Okay.
And the reason for that was that it became clear that vapes, especially just sort of cheap, the least expensive vapes, are made from sort of the leftover material, or sort of the less desirable plant matter.
Right.
And there are just all sorts of reasons why. And we later found out that there are companies that offer to buy dirty pesticides if they think they can dirty biomass, they call it, if they think they can extract the distillate oil and dilute it to a degree that they can pass the California regulations.
That was a crazy part of the article, is just reading that there's literal emails that are like tight or having the subject line like heavy metal and pesticide trim biomass. Like we're open to buying it because we're gonna essentially just make it into distillate, like you're saying, and put it into these vape carts. And hopefully these people are thinking that their distillation process or whatever it is going to remediate it and remove it, but it's clearly not. And something that's also talked about is how these distillate products that they're making are essentially concentrating the actual pesticides. It's not really diluting them out, because when you're creating a distillate or you're creating one of these cartridges, you're concentrating those cannabinoids and that biomass and the extract all together. So people are actually being exposed to more of these pesticides in these vape carts, which seems to be the biggest issue for safety concerns. Yeah, so that's very, very concerning. And I think we'll also talk about some brands as well, because you were reporting on that. So did you test any actual flour, or was it all distillate and vape carts?
There might have been one or two flour, and I think after 6 years, California, it took 6 years for California to issue its first cannabis pesticide recall, and that was for a flower product. But we were overwhelmingly testing vapes. There may have been one or two exceptions.
Okay, so let's dive into what you found because it is pretty insane the level that we're seeing here. Let's talk about the pesticides that are tested for in the cannabis market in California, but also the ones that aren't even tested for and maybe more common in tobacco testing rather than cannabis testing. And like,
Right.
and what are the health concerns? Like, what are people like really worried about here? Because, pesticides in general are meant to keep pests away, and they're often acting as like a neurotoxin to these pests. And the reason why drugs and so many substances work on us is because we're essentially giant pests. So they don't kill us, but they might make us feel weird in a different way. But if a substance is meant to kill something, it's definitely not going to be good for us if we're ingesting it in honestly any level for a lot of these compounds.
Right. I mean, pesticides is a huge sort of umbrella category, but it generally captures the idea of chemicals that are designed to kill or neutralize pests, so living things. So that in general, that's not the kind of thing you want in your body. But so we found several different categories. California, of all, I mean, there are many reasons to believe that there are similar problems in other states. But one thing California has is probably among the most rigorous pesticide testing requirements. So it requires that 66 pesticides be tested for, and of those, about a third you can't have any of, and the rest are there's a limit. And then so we found products that contained more than they were allowed of the limited pesticides. We found ones that contained the banned pesticides. Then we also found products that California doesn't test cannabis for, but which are being used on, which apparently are being used on cannabis products. So one of those was pymetrazine, which I'm told can help kill aphids, which is a major pest right now. But it's a chemical that's very limited in the U.S. and banned in several European countries and Canada, I believe. And I I don't want to get it wrong, but I believe it's a hormonal disruptor of certain kinds. So it sounds like something you don't want to mess with.
Yeah, I
And
was reading about it, and it's an endocrine disruptor, exactly what you're talking about. And it also has been shown to cause pretty severe liver damage as well when your body is processing this compound. So, I mean, and that's, yeah, I mean, that's very concerning. There's other compounds as well that have shown to be somehow involved in either like sperm counts or fertility in general. There's multiple of these pesticides that seem to affect fertility, which is very concerning. I think that's one of the most concerning things out of all of
sure.
this data.
No, absolutely. And then we found other pesticides that are banned in this country, but are apparently making it into some of the illegal grows. And these pesticides come from places like China and parts of Eastern Europe, where they're not necessarily as vigilant about consumer safety as we sometimes are in this country. So we found all different things. And to be clear, the results, we didn't have the budget or time or resources to test everything. It doesn't account for the whole market, but what it does suggest is that it's really impossible to pick up a vape and be sure that it's clean. Like there's no way to tell, because if the labs are not reporting accurate data for their customers, then there's really no sort of credible place to plant your confidence in the safety of a product.
Right, which is so concerning because I mean, I always think of specifically medical patients, right? Like we rely on this medicine to be tested, and that's part of what makes this medicine so expensive too, is like all of these lab costs that go into testing every part of the process. And if we can't trust the lab reports anymore, I mean, really, what are we supposed to do? And I think another thing that is a bit concerning is I think it kind of raises this question of what else are we not testing for that could potentially, be in these products, because it's really not easy to identify molecules that you don't know are in a product, because you need to essentially blindly look at it and start identifying all of these different compounds. And we know cannabis is a natural product. It has hundreds of different molecules, and now we're looking for ones that don't belong there. That can get really, really difficult. And, we kind of expect our regulatory agencies to be doing the due diligence, to be looking into these pesticides and looking into these other things. But it sounds like the regulations in California haven't been updated in a really long time, and I'm guessing this might be the case for other states as well. Can you speak on that at all?
Sure. So a couple different things. So California hasn't updated the 66 chemicals that need to be tested for since 2018. And that just doesn't reflect the reality of a fast-moving and fast-changing market that is responding to whatever is getting in the way of its crops in real time and trying things constantly. So that's one question. The other question is whether the state has the capacity to test for these compounds as well. After the story came out, the governor's office, the state didn't respond to our questions in large part. After the story came out, the governor's office said it had complete confidence in the agency, but it still hasn't, the agency hasn't done anything. Since the story came out, apparently we hear that more recalls may be coming, but that's unclear.
That is pretty surprising. I wonder if any state with like a legal market is gonna talk about it, because it definitely doesn't only affect California. I think California is just kind of the staple child that we use for cannabis a lot of the time, especially in these evolving markets. But who's to say that other states don't have the same problem going on? And I think that's what a lot of people wanted to know is like, are other states going to start testing for this? Are other independent investigators or labs going to start looking into this? And that's something I'm curious about too.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. There are states that have been more aggressive than California in issuing fairly sweeping recalls that disrupted the market, disrupted people's ability to find product at all, but they weren't confident in a lab or something like that, and they stepped in and attracted litigation, and it really invites issues to when you disrupt a market. But other states have been more willing to do it than California has.
And you mentioned that kind of this story exemplifies that we can't necessarily go just based on a COA, whether something's absolutely safe or not. Can we speak on that anymore? Because I think this might be the question I got the most when I asked the internet what they want to hear about with this story. And a lot of people are just saying, how do I make sure that the cannabis that I'm purchasing is safe and it's clean and it's not used with pesticides? Do you have any advice for people who want to make sure they're getting quality cannabis and trying to be as transparent as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure right now in California that you can, which sort of undermines the whole a major pillar of the case for the legal market. That said, I don't want to cast aspersions too widely, but certainly the impression is that vapes are the most problematic of the categories. But there may be problems with others as well. Another issue is that it's really unknown what a lot of these chemicals do when you combust and inhale them. They haven't been studied. So the degree to which we know the dangers of them, it's usually in the context of the agricultural workers who are spraying this stuff, and in really close contact to it, or perhaps in the context of eating it if it's on food. But in those cases, it goes through the digestive system and is filtered, as my understanding is, filtered at least some degree by the liver. Whereas if you ignite or heat something and suck on it, it goes straight into your lungs and into your bloodstream.
And it might be transformed during the heating process into a fully different molecule. We don't even know. We don't usually study things as far as like when they're combusted, if they're the same molecule as, or not. I do think that this article, I'm like a huge proponent for homegrow, and I know that everybody can't grow their own weed. But I do think it is a big advocacy piece for homegrow, because if you are seriously immunocompromised, either you're self-growing or somebody that you're close with that's growing cannabis, and that you can really ensure that they're putting quality material in and nothing, sketchy, I think that's great. And also just like looking for brands that are really proud of their product, that tell their story, that talk about, their nutrients that go into their plants, and want to advertise that and show people that maybe they're organic farmers and they're trying to show people that they're organic farmers. I think that's another good way to look for quality cannabis, rather than looking at a distillate cart that absolutely nothing about, other than it contains a lot of THC. But of course, these are different price points too, and not everyone has all these different products accessible to them. So, unfortunately, I hope that we can just regulate it to the point that we don't have these sketchy pesticides in our legal products. I also think this leads to the question of, why are people doing this? Is there really that much of a need for these potent pesticides that we have to use these for cannabis? I find this a little surprising, but I know that a lot of cultivators are under a lot of scrutiny, and we're trying to grow these massive amounts of cannabis in these small spaces, and we're getting more and more pests. What part in the supply chain, where is this happening? I don't want to use the term who's at fault, but that's what a lot of people are asking, essentially, is like, how is this happening, and why are people using these pesticides at these levels, these illegal pesticides at these levels in a medicinal plant crop?
So there are a couple things. I mean, there's a huge demand right now for vapes. They're just very, very popular. So that's part of it. Another part is that the market is under a lot of pressure. A lot of businesses have gone under. There are a variety of blights that they're encountering. You have to remember, cannabis is an agricultural crop. It is susceptible to the elements, and it sort of mass scale growing is a pretty new thing, and it's hard to do. And the bigger your farm is, the more it costs, and the harder it is to get it right. And not everybody in the industry is willing to do that. And as a result, it's very difficult to really be confident in the safety of product.
What do you think after this story, after this is leaked, what do you think the political ramifications are going to be in our industry? Because, it is a wellness industry. It's a medicinal plant industry, and it's something that we really talk about in the context as medicine, and this is really unacceptable in this industry. So what do you think's going to happen after this that's going to change to try to make sure that this isn't going to continue happening? Or do you think that they're going to respond at all? Or what are you thinking? What's the vibe?
So there's a bill in the California legislature right now that would crack down a bit. Among other things, it would require a secret shopper program for state regulators to buy products and test them. That bill, there was a hearing on it this morning, and it seemed to have quite a bit of support. So we might see a bill like that go through. And there are some other provisions as well. That the DCC hasn't really said anything, and the governor says it has his full confidence. Suggests that maybe they're not interested in responding, or maybe they're preparing like a big recall. There are rumors that more recalls are coming, and they're really going to step that up. They've been issuing a lot of recalls recently for a mold called aspergillus, which I may or may not be pronouncing correctly. But the problem is, at least the problem we talked about, is pesticides, and the reason there haven't been as many pesticide recalls, as I understand it, is that they're not able to test for those products. At least fairly recently, they weren't able to test for a lot of them. So as a result, we'll see. But for now, we'll see if the bill passes. We'll see if the DCC does anything. There have been one high-profile CEO has launched his own testing campaign, and he sort of described it as a quick and dirty effort at the beginning of a larger campaign to ensure customer safety. We'll see how far that goes.
I was going to ask you about this, and I didn't know how comfortable you felt talking about it, but you're already talking about it, so we can talk about it. So I saw something about this, too, that essentially a CEO at a different cannabis company was doing individual lab testing on the products that said were failed in this article, and they were finding that it didn't fail for some things. But to my knowledge, after reading what they had to say, they weren't testing for the illegal ones found overseas. I don't believe so. So I think it's still kind of exactly how it was, because they didn't really test for the same things. But they did test negative for some of the California tested pesticides, which is great. But you have to test for all of them in order to, reassure that you're actually corroborating what you're saying.
Right. So the only such test that I'm aware of was conducted by Elliot Lewis, who's the CEO of the retailer Catalyst Cannabis, and they tested a bunch of brands, some of which we tested for, some of which we didn't test for, and he found they were all clean, and they were all tested at one lab, and they only tested for the things California tested for. So it took a while for our story to come out. It's possible that some of the companies maybe cleaned up their act a little bit. If so, great. It's possible they missed it in the testing, but they also don't even claim to have tested for some of the other compounds, such as pymetrozine, which is California doesn't test for, and which is allowed in this country under certain circumstances. So.
Right. Would you feel comfortable discussing a few brands that maybe tested really, really bad when you were testing these products, and then a few brands that tested great, like they didn't have any of these pesticides? Just in case people are living in California, even if you don't want to discuss the bad, just discussing a few good brands that, just based on this limited study, just which ones were safe as far as pesticides go.
I don't want to necessarily test the good ones, because we didn't test that many. Like, the majority of about 40 products we tested came up with something, even if it was just an allowed chemical below the California limit.
Oh,
so
okay.
I don't want to necessarily endorse any. I will say, I guess I would say, read the story. Various folks have sort of tried to question the findings on social media, and I don't really have any comment on their comments, other than that we stand by our reporting.
Yeah, it's pretty well outlined in the story, and I'll put that, as I mentioned, in the show notes, and very available for anyone who wants to read it. But there are some pretty big brands in California. So if you are somebody who enjoys vape carts, I would just look into the story and look at least the ones that tested very, very, very negative, because you might want to avoid those. And, also be asking questions when you go to a dispensary about where the flower comes from, or about the company in general. Or I should say about the, concentrates, the distillates, whatever it is. Ask questions about it. It's okay to be a little annoying at a dispensary. I definitely am every single time. But yeah, unfortunately, like this isn't something that's going to be on a COA, because if something did test negative for, or I should say, if something did test positive for pesticides on a COA, it wouldn't be in that legal dispensary, or at least hopefully it would be culled before that point. So all of these that we're kind of talking about here aren't reported accurately, or they're just not tested for on that COA, unfortunately. Okay, do you mind if we do a little bit of rapid fire? Because I asked Instagram.
Happy to.
Okay, I asked Instagram just a few questions of what they wanted to know, and I got like over 100 responses. We're not going to ask all of them, but we're going to ask a few to you. Okay, how do these levels that are found in these cartridges, how do these compare to the levels of something like pesticides that we're exposed to in the produce aisle at the grocery store? Do we know?
Okay. So I would say the main differences are the products we're exposed to in the grocery store are known to the EPA, and essentially the science on the dangers they pose is well known, or at least we know what's not known about it. And the other thing is that we're eating the products as opposed to inhaling them, which seems to be a more direct route into the bloodstream.
That's a great point.
So essentially, we don't know everything about the chemicals we're finding in the pot, and we are breathing it into our lungs as opposed to eating it.
All right. Another question. What are the signs and symptoms if you were exposed to these pesticides? Is there something we should be looking for in ourselves or our community that we can say, okay, if you have XYZ, you might be exposed to something in your cannabis?
I don't know if it's the same for all of them. In one case, there's a former agricultural worker who's suing a pretty high-profile brand, claiming that working with these pesticides, that they made them spray, made them dizzy and nauseous and stuff like that. There are, with some of the illegal pesticides, there have been signs of state workers and law enforcement and other kinds of enforcement agents being advised to wear hazmat gear and stuff like that, if in case they're exposed to these things in facilities.
Oh, that's so nasty. And I was doing a little bit of research on this too. I was reading that some short-term things to be looking for is like nausea, disorientation, and confusion. Some longer-term issues could be neurological damage. As we mentioned, a lot of these pesticides work on the brains of insects, so it would be a similar target in our own body. Endocrine disruptors, which we mentioned, which have implications in reproductive health, loss of appetite, weakness, heart issues. And then for med patients specifically those who are using for epilepsy, Parkinson's, and other neurological disorders, I mean, I think this is the most concerning for that population of people, just because, your brain's already a little more sensitive. And if you have a toxin essentially on your brain, it can be really, really damaging. Okay, let's keep going. Is there any type of regulation? Do brands have to tell us what pesticides and how much they use in their products? Is that regulated at all, that transparency?
So the levels are set. The levels for for 66 pesticides are set by the state. Of those, 20 can't be detected at all, and the remaining 45 or so have a limit roughly akin to what is allowed in cigarettes, which hasn't been tested because it was decided that cigarettes are dangerous enough that we don't really need to test all the chemicals that go into them.
Oh my God.
And I think it's probably also worth mentioning that about 5 years ago, right before the pandemic, there was a crisis where sort of a thinning agent of some kind that's generally been agreed to be known as vitamin E acetate was found in some unlicensed products. And some people who just had a few hits ended up very sick in the hospital or even dead. And this is a different situation where we're we're not aware of any cases where something like that has happened because of pesticides. It's more like cigarettes, where it's one of the most, it's very dangerous, but the effects are caused by chronic, are likely caused by chronic use over years.
Okay, so I guess that's positive. If you only have one of these cartridges in your lifetime, that's better than repeat use. But kind of like what we're talking about, if you do have a 1 gram cart and you're hitting that all the time, you kind of are getting pretty heavy repeat use from even just one cartridge. I mean, I don't know what's like medically relevant, but that seems still scary to me. And you mentioned licensed versus unlicensed cannabis businesses. Do we think that this pesticide issue is mostly happening within the licensed or unlicensed arm of the cannabis industry in California?
So for the story, we only tested products that we bought in licensed dispensaries because those are the ones that are supposed to be clean. That
Right.
said, I mean, there's plenty of reason to believe that the borders between the licensed and unlicensed market is a thin membrane, or a holy membrane. The exact word I'm thinking of is escaping me. But those, there are products that start out in the illegal market and make it into the legal market and then get diverted back out. And there's also, I would say, a pretty strong possibility that some products that are testing, that are too dirty, are being diverted by companies to the illegal market. So there's a good chance that illegal products are as dirty, if not dirtier. There may be some that aren't, but there's a good chance that illegal products are dirtier. We just didn't do those tests.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I agree with there's probably a lot of overlap, or maybe a bit more than most people think, between the licensed and unlicensed cannabis industry, at least in some parts of the U.S. I really liked this question, which was, how aware do you think that the brands were that there were pesticides in their products? And I think this is all speculation, but kind of what we're talking about with supply chain issues, maybe these reputable brands were buying products that they thought were reputable but weren't. Do you have any insight on that question?
So focusing on vapes, I mean, it's a very murky market. And the brands, the reputable brands that are, they have an interest in buying less expensive, cheaper product, less expensive product, and dirty product sells for less. So, but they have an interest in maybe not knowing why their oil seems to be so much less expensive than somebody else's oil. And we also found that there are manufacturers who take oil and they'll receive a vat of oil, and then they will parse it out into thousands of vapes, which are from competing brands. So I don't think, in a lot of cases, the brands probably don't have too much insight, and they don't really benefit from asking hard questions.
Yeah, that's a good answer. So I think that's probably all I'll ask from these Instagram questions. I think those were some really good ones. As we're wrapping up, first I want to say thank you for doing your investigative journalism. I know it's not easy to get the hate for kind of speaking the truth on some things, but I think this needs to be brought up as our industry continues to evolve and mature, just making sure that we do have a medicinal product, we do have a wellness product, and that we're keeping each other in line and making sure we're providing the highest quality medicine to people. So wanted to thank you for that right off the bat, and give you kind of the floor if you want to talk about anything that you thought was surprising while unveiling this article, or any other similar articles in cannabis that you want listeners to be aware of that you've also worked on in the past.
Well, I mean, I guess I'll just say thanks so much for having me and taking an interest in the subject. And if your readers are involved in the cannabis industry and something's on their mind, they're always welcome to reach out to me. You can email me at alex@weedweek.com, or and if that is not secure enough, maybe send me a DM on LinkedIn, and I can give you a more secure way to reach me. Thanks so much, and I mean the feedback. There's been a lot of. It's definitely made some noise, but what to do about it is sort of unclear. And you say that the industry needs to take an interest in wellness, and within the industry, that the idea that cannabis is medicine or a wellness product or what have you is sort of taken for granted, but a lot of companies don't necessarily always live up to that. And there have been, for instance, there have been at least two incidents of workers dying on the job from apparently inhaling lung diseases caused,
or just the fine particles that are involved in cannabis processing. Like if you inhale a lot of that, it clogs up your airways and it can be really dangerous.
So just because the industry believes in the benefits of its products, that doesn't mean that everybody is acting in a responsible manner. So be careful.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to go out. And also, if you do live in a state with a med or adult use program, make sure your products are getting tested anyway, because these regulations do change state to state. It is all public. Definitely look into, at the very least, what is required for your cannabis to be tested for, especially if you are a medical patient. It's something to definitely look into, make sure you're getting the highest quality cannabis possible. But thank you again so much, Alex, for taking the time to be on. And I will again attach the link to the article in the show notes of this episode. And we'll just continue the conversation on Instagram and Patreon and wherever else that we connect on the internet. So mad love, everyone. And we will see you again in a couple weeks.